Está andando? Sì, sembrerebbe, 24 secondi.
Okay. Okay, so we should be live, and I'm sorry for the delay. I think we could start now. So this is Andrzejewski, and from the University of Warsaw, and his talk is a plea for the new ontology of landscapes. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for inviting me to Padova. And as you said, the title of my paper is a plea for the new ontology of landscapes. So basically, in this paper, this is a paper based on joint research with Mateusz Salva from my university. And I would like to give you the new ontology of landscapes, or at least to propose a new approach to ontology of landscapes. But before presenting my argument or presenting my proposal, let me begin with a short thought experiment that will guide our intuitions regarding the nature of landscapes. So imagine a group of persons taking a walk through a street in the city of Jerusalem on his or her much-deserved holiday trip. They are clearly tourists enjoying Mediterranean weather and historic views. But imagine for a moment that they are visiting the same city for completely different reasons. It is Good Friday and they are praying at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. As Christian pilgrims, they are seeking atonement for their sins. Not only is the city place, yet try to imagine yet another option. These people actually live in Jerusalem all their lives. Not only is the city place where they dwell, but also one of the symbols of the ancient and very painful conflict that they are deeply involved in. They are Israelis or Palestinians. The imaginary individuals clearly differ from each other in many ways. They follow often incompatible sets of values, emotions, and beliefs, and they engage in and conceptualize the world in divergent manners. It seems that the only thing that is common to all of them is the city itself, to which they relate in one way or another, and where they may cross each other. Imagine now they accidentally meet on the one of the street corners. Can we say that they have met in the city space, the same city space? Would they think that they are in the same city space, or would they rather think that their city spaces are somehow different? If we ignore for a moment the supposedly unusual character of these questions, we may claim that it is more than obvious that these people are situated in the same city space. How could anyone even think that it is otherwise? The people mentioned in this scenario may see, interpret, or appreciate Jerusalem differently, but the city as an object of their experiences, thoughts, and evaluations remains the same. In other words, the city space is objective. Such a view is suggested not only by common sense, but also by many approaches within landscape studies, including aesthetics. At the same time, however, landscapes are quite often treated as personal insofar they consist not only of places or surroundings where one is or once was, but also of projections of one's inner life, and as such, they appear to be very intimate and subjective, for example, childhood landscapes. From this point of view, one may say that the individuals in the above thought experiment cannot meet in the same city space, even if we may claim that as tourists, they may in fact meet in tourist Jerusalem, while as believers in pilgrims Jerusalem, and as city dwellers in their local Jerusalem. Yet the three Jerusalems are different and overlap only partly, if at all. So that was a short thought experiment, and now I'm going to give you some assumptions for this presentation. So basically, obviously, we have natural landscapes and urban landscapes, and there are some differences between natural landscapes and urban landscapes. but for the purpose of this presentation, I would like to say something more general, something about landscapes like as a general category. So I'm gonna omit this. Discrepancies between natural landscapes and urban landscapes. And whenever we think of and appreciate or even talk about landscapes, we implicitly make an assumption as to what a landscape is. So we have a tacit ontology, at least very weak ontology about what kind of entity a landscape is. Yet, in spite of the growing importance of landscape studies, just few ruminate on the ontology of landscapes, discussing how landscapes exist, what kind of entities they explicitly are, and how they are individuated. So the goal of my paper is to critically assess the philosophical approaches of aesthetic appreciation of landscapes in order to show what ontologies lie behind them. It suggests a distinct approach that goes beyond the well-known distinction of art and non-art dichotomy in landscape appreciation. So, in other words, I would like to offer you an ontology of landscapes according to which a landscape should not be conceived as an object, but as a kind of experiencing of someone's surroundings. And I label my position as experience ontology, so this working title. My paper has the following structure. So firstly, I'm going to very briefly remind you on two dominating approaches in landscape appreciation. And more importantly, I'm going to focus on ontological dimensions or ontological components of that aesthetic theories, namely the scenic ontology. I call it scenic ontology, and the second one is the reductionist ontology. In the next move, I'm going to take a close look on very recent development in landscape ontology that is authored by Yuri Benowski. And I would like to present you some challenges to his approach. And in the last part, I'm going to present you my own proposal, how to approach landscapes from the ontological side. But let me begin with the term landscape. So obviously it is rooted, it has double meaning. So it is rooted on the one hand in geographical and legal vocabulary, on the other hand in artistic practice. So as I said, it has a double meaning today. It may refer either to a stretch of land distinct from its surroundings or to a view of it, especially when such a view may be prized for its aesthetic qualities. And philosophers tend to focus on the latter and consequently are mainly interested in aesthetic appreciation of landscapes. However, the approach suggested below is a bit different. So, as I said, we have aesthetic theories of landscapes, and these theories are interested mainly in aesthetic appreciation of landscapes, or alternatively, what aesthetic qualities landscapes have. However, I would like to omit these theories, what aesthetic qualities of landscape have, and focus exclusively on ontological parts of these aesthetic theories, because I claim that every aesthetic theory of appreciation has at least very small or weak tacit ontological component. I just want to today take a close look at these ontological components. So the first model is called the scenic model or landscape model of appreciation, and its ontology, I call it the scenic ontology. And the second model is the environmental model of appreciation, and I call ontology that lies under that model the reductionist ontology. So when we think about landscapes, we usually think about nice views, nice places, aesthetically pleasing, astonishing massives, or some lakes, forests, this kind of views. And these This intuition is covered by the first model of appreciation, scenic model of appreciation, or landscape model of appreciation. So in terms of aesthetic appreciation, landscape is appreciated in formal terms. So this interest approach is applied, and no special concepts are involved in our aesthetic appreciation and aesthetic experience of landscapes. But landscapes appreciation requires, though, framing, and secondly, looking at it from an adequate standpoint, so as if it were a photograph. And this model of appreciation presupposes the same ontology, that in ontological terms, a landscape is an object, is purely visual, is static, is two-dimensional, and it is detached from the observer. And obviously, there are some advantages of this model of appreciation, this same ontology. So basically, it describes what the term landscape means to people when they aesthetically appreciate their surroundings, which is the case, for instance, whenever they travel as tourists longing for scenic views. However, it has also some disadvantages. So ontologically speaking, taking a landscape as a purely visual and static model, a static object, scenic ontology ignores smell, hearing, and touch from our appreciation. And secondly, maybe more importantly, this ontology misrepresents the relationship between people and their surroundings, because people are basically detached from landscapes, are not part of landscape. They are not a part of surrounding. So landscape model as an aesthetic theory can be criticized on ontological grounds for imposing on reality categories that are alien to it. For example, we may criticize this model of appreciation for seeing landscapes in terms of picturesque paintings. And this model has been criticized widely by many people, and the most opponent of this model and the most proponent of the alternative model, that is environmental model, is Alan Carson. So in his words, I'm quoting, "The landscape model construes the environment as though it were a static, essentially two-dimensional representation, reducing it to a scene or view. But the natural environment is not a scene, not a representation, not static, and not two-dimensional. In short, the model requires that the environment be appreciated not as what it is and with the qualities it has, but at what it is not and with qualities it does not have. The model is unsuited to the actual nature of the object of appreciation," unquote. And also, Carson suggests that the term landscape should be replaced with term environment, and this is why I call his ontology reductionist ontology, because he, as I read him, he gets rid of the term landscape and suggests to replace it with the term environment as more suitable. So in terms of aesthetic appreciation, environment is appreciated as environment, so not as art, and according to objective categories. It requires adequate knowledge, which firstly offers a frame, and secondly, it determines which is to be appreciated and how. So we need some scientific knowledge in order to appreciate, for example, amount massives from geography or geology or chemistry or physics or whatever. And this model of appreciation presupposes the reductionist ontology. So basically, an environment is a setting consisting of objects, processes, and relations. It is experienced with all the senses, is dynamic, three-dimensional, and it is a setting in which people are immersed. This ontology also has some advantages. So, for example, it describes the relationship between people and their environments, that people are not detached from the environment, they are a part of the environment, so they are immersed in it. And also, It offers an approach to results that results in a richer aesthetic appreciation, mainly because it treats landscape as a three-dimensional and dynamic entity, not two-dimensional and not static. So the environmental model as aesthetic model of appreciation describe the aesthetic experience as multisensual and as concept-based. On the other hand, we may enumerate also some disadvantages. So, for example, the reductionist ontology takes white nature to be the paradigm of environment in general. It also ignores such factors as emotions, imaginations, and cultural background. And lastly, the reductionist ontology underplays sensual aspects of environment, for example, a mood or an aura of a given environment. So in the next step, I would like to say something on the very recent development in the ontology of landscapes, authored by Yuri Benowski. And he explores the notion of landscapes in a manner similar to the one implied by the scenic ontology. So basically, he develops the scenic ontology. But in terms of aesthetic appreciation, he tries to mix points from the landscape model and from environmental model as well. But today I'm not interested in his model of aesthetic appreciation. I just would like to focus on the ontology, Benowski's ontology of landscapes. But what is unusual is that Benowski explicitly starts from establishing the general ontology of landscapes and based on that moves to aesthetic issues. However, as I shall point out, his own ontological theory faces a number of problems as well. But before giving you some challenges, I would like to give you his ontological theory in a nutshell. So basically, a landscape is a static perspectival entity. So, quoting Benowski, where the creator of the landscape necessarily happens to be the same person as the spectator, and where her scientific and other knowledge and beliefs matter for the aesthetic, for the appreciation to be complete. Unquote. So, landscapes are not entirely mind-independent entities. They by necessity require a creator, who is by necessity a spectator. Landscapes are different from mind-independent environment. And lastly, they are purely visual entities. What we cannot see isn't a part of a landscape. And in explaining the ontological nature of landscapes, Benowski sees serious affinity with photographs. So, firstly, landscapes like photographs are mind-independent entities. No observer, no landscape, no photographer, no photographer. Secondly, landscapes like photographs are framed and taken from a specific point of view in a defined time. And here I'm quoting Benowski. When it comes to the aesthetic appreciation of both the landscape and the photograph, the time at which it was observed taken is absolutely crucial. Indeed, in this case, it is the main thing that makes it aesthetically interesting. Thus, aesthetic properties of landscapes, like aesthetic properties of photographs, are relative to a framing, a point of view, an observer, and the time of observation. All of this should be included in the basis in which the aesthetic properties are grounded. Next, landscapes and photographs are always involve existence of something real in the world. So, in that point, Benowski follows explicitly Kendall Walton's transparency thesis regarding photographs. Again, in Benowski's word, the idea is then this: when we see a photograph of the Matterhorn, given the transparency thesis, we see the Matterhorn itself. When we look at the Matterhorn and we appreciate the resultant landscape, we see the Matterhorn itself as well, frame and all, as we have already seen, unquote. Thus, landscapes are seen to be representation, mind-independent environment. And lastly, attention management techniques in photography and landscape are quite similar. Again, in Benoski's word, the photographer chooses such and such a framing because she wants her spectator to look at such and such a thing and focus on it. The same is true about landscapes. Unquote. So, interesting as it is, I think Benoski's theory faces a number of problems as well. And in a nutshell, according to Benoski, a landscape is individuated by an observer of the landscape who firstly is by necessity the landscape creator and who secondly frames it by virtue of the fact that the landscape is taken from a certain perspective, a standpoint, at a certain time. As a result, a static observer dependent entity comes into existence. So, taking the affinity with photographs seriously, as Benoski does, we end up with a view that firstly our eyes work in a similar way to camera lens, and secondly, every frame is unique and limited to a particular observer, because by necessity an observer is also a spectator of a given landscape. And I would like to formulate two objections, two fallacies. The first one is the individuation fallacy, the second one is the representational fallacy. So let me start with the individuation fallacy. Imagine that you are admiring a wonderful setting, say a seacoast in Italy near Viareggio. Of course. Every time you close and open your eyes, a new landscape is created. Thus, when admiring a Mediterranean tempest in Jerusalem, we are forced to say that we are watching a number of subsequent landscapes, since a landscape is something static, not dynamic. So, every change in a landscape is in fact a creation of a new one. And I think this is counterintuitive. Firstly, because it clashes with our everyday practice with landscape, that we need a minute or two or even half an hour to appreciate one landscape, for example with a cigarette or with a coffee or with a glass of wine from our balcony. And we need, for example, a while to appreciate it properly, and we still claim that we see the same landscape even if there are some changes in it. For example, even if we, let's say that this is a Mediterranean tempest or something like that, or a quick shower, and we appreciate it from our balcony with a cup of warm tea or coffee. It is quite intuitive to claim that it is the same landscape, although it is quite dynamic and it is not static, obviously. But this fallacy has also another phase. So again, imagine that you are admiring a beautiful setting. You are not alone, since this is a date. Obviously, fingers crossed for this day. So taking seriously Benoski's theory, you can't be sure that you are watching literally the same landscape as your date does. You may be very close to each other, but she or he could take a step or two further, or just you may pay attention to a slightly different part of the surrounding. This can change the frame and, as a consequence, a landscape. So the consequence is that landscapes are very private and can't be shared with others. And I think this is also counterintuitive, because firstly, we do claim that we share landscapes with other people, at least in some situations. And here, taking the affinity with photographs, we can't say that, because basically every spectator of a landscape is its creator. So when we change a frame even a bit, like in case of photographs, we are making very similar but ontologically distinct photograph. And secondly, I think if we accept this consequence, we also lose the critical dimension of aesthetic theory of landscape appreciation. Because even if we build a very well developed criteria for aesthetic appreciation of landscapes, unless we can't apply them to the same object, which is literally not possible in that situation, we can't be sure that we have a substantial argument between individuals. Because, literally speaking, I have access to my own landscape, and you have access to your landscapes. We may claim that they are very similar, but ontologically speaking, we are talking about two different entities. So I'm not sure how we may proceed this substantial argument over aesthetic qualities of our landscapes. And the second fallacy is the representational fallacy. So it refers instead to the ontological relationship between landscapes and environment, both natural and human. The former are mind-dependent objects, whereas the latter are mind-independent entities. In addition, environment is more inclusive. It can be said that environment is an objective background for subjective landscapes. There is, however, another connection between the two. As I said, landscapes are transparent, and we here follow Benoski's transparency thesis, which means that when we are looking at a landscape, we actually see environment as well. So in Benoski's view, when we are looking at the Mount of Olives, we actually admire its landscape, and thus we see two things, the landscape and the Mount of Olives itself. Thus we actually see two entities. In case of photographs, it makes perfect sense, because we can admire a photograph of a given surrounding and these surroundings, and obviously they are separate entities. But in terms of landscapes, it seems to be quite questionable. This is not clear why we should not experience environment on its own rights and not as represented by something different from it. The second case ends up with the situation when environment might be seen or broadly experienced in a framework belonging to a different domain of entities. For example, to like art, like objects in the landscape model of appreciation. So according to Benoski, in the landscape situation, we experience environment as something represented by the landscape itself. And also it is quite counterintuitive, because it implies that we see and so experience environment through the landscape as a separate entity, and this clashes with the intuitive view that both natural and human environments should be experienced as directly as possible. So here is time for my proposal of landscape ontology, and I would call it the experience ontology. And I hope it is free from the shortcomings faced by the scenic ontology, reductionist ontology, and Benoski's theory. And in order to do so, in order to introduce you with this experience ontology, it will be useful to point out explicitly which points of the above theories we are about to accept and incorporate into our approach. So firstly, following scenic ontology, I accept the distinction between landscape and environment by claiming that the concept of landscape refers to something different than environment, and as such is informative, so we need, or we may keep the term of landscape in our aesthetic and ontological vocabulary. Secondly, I take for granted that the environment is objective, dynamic, three-dimensional, and experienced with all the senses. In that respect, I follow the reductionist ontology. So here's the thesis. A landscape should be understood not as a kind of entity, but rather as a way of experiencing someone's surroundings. In other words, when we describe something as a landscape, we really mean a specific way of experiencing of a given environment. And in fact, whenever we use this term, we refer to our experience in the first place. So in order to substantialize my thesis, I think the concept of narrative is very useful. And gladly, in the environmental aesthetics, there are some noble papers on the role of stories or narratives in the aesthetic appreciation of nature or environments. However, they are treated in aesthetic terms, so they explain how stories or narratives can play a role in our aesthetic appreciation of nature or environments. And I would like to be more radical, so I would like to move this role from aesthetics to ontology, but let me begin with aesthetics. So Sherry Foster pointed out two paradigms regarding the aesthetic appreciation of nature, namely the ambient model, and I'm not here today interested in that model, in the second one, which is the narrative model. In her words, what we do in each case, we read the surface of the environment as a kind of story. We filter the perceptual properties of nature's surface through a frame of reference that functions as narrative in character, one that conceptualizes the objects before us as players in a partially invisible drama, unquote. In other words, according to Foster, a narrative is a discourse on the, in her word, invisible or intangible events and processes beneath, beyond, and before it, the invisible environment. In such cases, the narratives are offered by natural sciences, which allow us to think of nature as something ordered and dramatically structured. There is always a story to be told about a given environment. And Thomas Yates argues in favor of a diversity of stories, so not only scientific stories, stating that the role of stories in aesthetic appreciation of nature is to extend endurance of aesthetic experience and enrich our aesthetic horizons. And he enumerates three kinds of stories. The first one, aesthetic stories like poems. The second, non-artistic stories like mythology. And the last one, not verbally expressed stories that tell stories in non-verbal fashion, such as paintings, buildings, sculptures, films, and the like. So my contention is that landscapes are framed and the necessary frames are defined by narratives which guides one's experiences. The term narrative refers here to an explanatory account of facts which allows to frame and understand the connection between them. So this is a very broad notion of narrative. Narratives are often colored with one's beliefs, emotions, values, expectations, interests, purposes. These elements are crucial for one's story and to which people would refer explicitly and implicitly if they were asked to describe the landscape that are looking at. So basically, I'm claiming that narratives are responsible for the individuation of landscapes, yet narratives are distinct from landscapes. That is, narratives enable to shape and give a sense of unity for a special way of experiencing an environment. And in order to show you how this idea works, I would like to give you another thought experiment, which is another scenario, which is likely unlikely to happen, but I think it tells quite a lot about on the nature of narratives in landscapes ontology. So imagine that you are on desert vacation, and at the moment you are traveling with a group of people across the Sahara Desert. You are chosen You've chosen this destination because you are a huge fan of quiet, monotone, and unified surroundings. So you have plenty time to think about your book proposal in philosophical aesthetics, obviously, because no distractions are involved. Whereas your fellows have been motivated by good memories, for example, trip with parents as a kid, during a childhood, or a sense of snobbery, or our old-fashioned desire to experience something new. Of course, every participant of this trip focuses on different aspects of the desert and thus experiences it differently. But imagine that something horrific happened. Your guide just passed away. Since that sad moment, you are fighting for life. You got completely lost without water, food, etc. United with the others, you are desperate to survive. And this is the, I couldn't help presenting this image. This is the only one desert in Poland we have. This is Błędowski Desert. So we have in Poland desert. As you can see, it is not the most scariest desert that you can imagine. But let's go back to Sahara Desert. In the first case, when everything is all right, there were many landscapes as people experienced the desert differently as they referred consciously to many personal associations, purposes, and expectations, and probably made a number of incomplete judgments about the desert, including aesthetic judgments. In the second case, however, an additional dominating landscape came into existence. People had the same goal and thought in a very similar way about their surroundings, and even if their previous experiences determined by their personal narratives probably still counted to some extent, they were superseded by a common way of experiencing based on a narrative on how to survive. The new narrative inflects other personal narratives, making them overlapping or resembling each other. It does not mean that people do not experience the hostile environment in slightly different ways. They might experience the threat to our survival differently according to what is at stake. For example, some may be overwhelmed by the idea of never seeing their partner or their children again, or never setting things right with their parents, or of never writing this groundbreaking, outstanding book in philosophical aesthetics, for example. But here is the objection to what I just said, that it is not possible for two or more individuals to share the same narrative. If it's the case, they do not share the same landscape. And my answer is that we don't need strict identity between persons' mental states, which is obviously not possible for a narrative to be shared. Narratives are associated with reasons, beliefs, statements, with some sort of hierarchy among them, and obviously it depends the level of flexibility that we are allowed in our narrative. It depends on the type of a given narrative. So, for example, scientific narratives are probably less flexible, they are less flexible and more organized than, for example, artistic narratives or even religious narratives, I believe. So, it can be said that a narrative N is shared by a group of individuals at the same time when they act and think in a very similar way when they face a situation B at T. In other words, a shared narrative allows people to think about their surrounding in ways that are more similar to each other than where the ways they thought about the surroundings before. Individual narratives are not replaced by the shared narrative, but are made more similar and even overlapping thanks to the shared narrative, and it enables to experience a given environment as a common ground for a group of individuals. So sharing a landscape with other people amounts to sharing a narrative about the environment with these people. This of course does not mean that people enjoy the same unit of experience, which is not possible, but that they participate in a certain way of experiencing the shared environment. Another necessary factor for creating a landscape is that one has to sensually experience given surroundings. So going back to Jerusalem scenario, Christian pilgrims share a religious landscape of Jerusalem only when they are in the city, or at least they visited the city in the past. A narrative about a given place reveals how one experiences his or her actual surroundings. Narratives inevitably belong to individuals, which results in the landscapes being personal in the first place, insofar as they are defined by those narratives. Yet, people may share narratives with other people, which makes them experience an environment in the same way, except for inevitable differences rooted in them as individuals, which is always possible. And I think this aspect of experience ontology explains the possibility of to learn someone's landscape, which is quite important, I think. So this possibility means that she or he can guide me how to experience a piece of reality as he or she does. For this, a mere explanation of the narrative is not enough. It is quite unlikely that a tourist accepts the mode of behaving a pilgrim, and vice versa. To learn a landscape is to make someone's narrative our own, or at least to think that it could be mine to some extent. Learning someone's landscape, so finding out how someone experiences her surroundings, does not amount to sharing it. In fact, one may be said to share someone's landscape when not only she knows how this other person experiences her environment, but also when she identifies herself with this attitude. So, basically, when she endorses this way of experiencing as her own. And here is the objection, possible objection to the experience ontology. So, does every experience of environment land into landscape? Because this is the possible worry. So, I would like to say no. A landscape is a meaningful way of experiencing the environment. And this means that a person is to be aware of his or her own narrative. So, I mean by this values, expectations, knowledge, etc. And this is especially seen when we want to learn other people to experience an environment as a cultural landscape. For example, a foreigner learns to perceive lakes and forests as a Finnish national landscape. So imagine that you are in Finland and you probably you would need a Finn to explain you how you should approach lakes and landscapes as a part of national landscape. Yes, I think the same is in Italy, the same could be in Great Britain, and in other places. They may be not just national, but they also may be local. The same is true with not natural landscape, but with urban landscape. How to approach a given city as a local, according to local narratives, local mythology, local urban legends, this kind of stuff. And here is the definition of landscape. So a landscape, X is a landscape if and only if. X is a kind of experiencing. A person A follows X of an environment E at the moment T. A by X ascribes to E a set of values V. V is ascribed to E thanks to a narrative N, and A is aware of the narrative N. And here's another objection to what I just said. that by proposing the ontological shift from object to experiencing, experience ontology makes our ontology a bit elusive if you compare it with existing theories of landscapes. Because in that theories, we have objects, not ways of experiencing. But my answer is not really. In the existing theories, what is intuitive is aesthetics rather than ontology. That is, the landscape model and the environmental model indeed cover certain intuitions about aesthetic appreciation, namely, what we may admire, that we may admire formal qualities in a given landscape, or that we need or we always experience our surrounding in a multisensual way, and we need to apply some kind of knowledge or beliefs. But this is aesthetic. This is aesthetics. But when it comes to ontology, the situation seems to be far more complicated. The scenic ontology consists of a landscape as static and two-dimensional, and in the final analysis leads to Bernoussi conclusions, which are radical and unlikely to be accepted. Instead, the reductionist ontology completely eliminates the concept of landscape as informative and replaces it with the concept of environment. And I think it is valuable to keep the concept of landscape in our aesthetic or ontological vocabulary. So going back to the Jerusalem scenario, contrary to scenic ontology, implying that these people cannot be located in the same city space as landscapes are observer-dependent visual phenomena, as well as contrary to reductionist ontology, according to which there can, as a landscape is just an environment where people are physically present, the scenic ontology suggests that how their location is interpreted depends on how they experience Jerusalem. If they all experience it accordingly to a shared narrative, then they may in fact be thought as a situation situated in the same landscape. For example, in the tourist Jerusalem or the dwellers Jerusalem or in local Jerusalem. But if their narratives have no in common elements, their landscapes are different even if they experience the same surrounding. And what is at stake here is not so much a physical, trivial presence occupying a location in the three-dimensional space, which is always possible, but being in a place experienced as something meaningful. By associating the idea of landscape with how people experience their surroundings, the scenic ontology is a bit phenomenological and as such is the answer to the initial question. It is not possible to answer it in any other manner than by taking the standpoint of the protagonist of the Jerusalem scenario. It also, this experience ontology, I think, has other advantages. So, for example, it remains untouched by the representational fallacy and by the individuation fallacy. So, in terms of representational fallacy, the experience ontology defines a landscape as observer-dependent. It does not explain it in terms of a representation, as it claims that an environment is experienced directly, and landscape is just someone's way of experiencing it. In terms of the individuation fallacy, the experience ontology explains both the changeability and permanence of landscapes. On the one hand, as long as a person is committed to a narrative, to a certain way of experiencing an environment, a landscape is constant and coherent regardless of any changes in the experience environment may undergo. On the other hand, the same environment might be experienced differently by the same person on different occasions. Thus, there are two different landscapes at two different moments. So, the experience ontology counts for people's intuitions about landscapes, intuitions that are often blurred and contradictory, and cause them to claim that landscapes are private yet public, or that they are nice views or nice places. According to experience ontology, there are private landscapes that belong to particular individuals, and that there are common landscapes that people share, or at least believe they share. One in the same environment might be thus experienced as either a private landscape or as a shared one. There is a continuity between these kinds of experiencing, which enables one to shift his or her attitude, so replace one's geographical narrative into a national one. This means that it is possible to shape the way how one experiences his or her surroundings, for example, by offering him or her a new narrative. So to conclude, it has been suggested that at the beginning that the philosophical discussion of landscapes is mainly focused on aesthetics, and that aesthetic theory, in many cases, doesn't provide an explicit ontological account what landscapes are. This has a relevant impact on philosophical aesthetics itself, since the ontology of landscapes seems to be crucial for any theory of landscapes aesthetic appreciation. I try to propose an alternative ontology of landscapes which avoids the problems generated by the other ontologies. The main idea is that what we call landscape is in fact not an object, but rather a special way of experiencing an environment. I claim that landscapes are individuated on the basis of narratives, and also the processes of sharing and learning somewhat landscapes, which is highly intuitive, I guess, has been formulated and explained in terms of the new ontological approach, which is the experience ontology. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, I would invite you to use the iPad as a microphone, just to make sure that they can be heard. And yeah.
Do you buy it or not?
I have quite a few questions, but I wait.
Oh, well, okay, so I'm speaking like that. No, one thing, typically, when we posit a kind of multiplication of entities in philosophy, that is, consider your proposal or any other proposal you have discussed as opposed to a kind of reductionist model.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, well, we are driven to this kind of idea of multiplying stuff, so that we have landscapes over and above environments and stuff like that, by strong intuitions that these things have very different properties than the other things. And, there are, typically that is because there are contrasting judgments about, maybe landscapes, if you want to go subjective or cultural in the way you want to go, which there are judgments which sound to us exactly as good as true and are inconsistent with one another. So if I speak about the way in which I experience, I don't know, Apple, I can say that, well, the way in which I experience the Apple is, I don't know, rootless or whatever. Yeah. Yours is different, and there's nothing wrong because these are our own respective ways. So, but I'm asking to you, this is my first question, but maybe I can do some other questions as the discussion goes. But my first question is, do you really think that there is such a pressure? Because if the only judgments the only things on which we disagree upon are kind of value or aesthetic stuff, this may be accounted for by positing a kind of relativist semantics of value discourse or whatever. So are there really objective, not value-related pieces of discourse in which we disagree about landscapes, but we feel that we both are correct, without using kind of aesthetic or value vocabulary. Okay. Don't know if my question is clear, but this is so.
So thank you for this question. So I do think that there are some features that we may argue about in landscapes that are not aesthetic. But let me, just to clarify. So landscape is, according to this theory, is not an object. It's just a way of experiencing the surrounding. So when we may obviously ascribe some features to way of experiencing, but this is not what you asked, because I think you asked about the qualities of the environment. Because in my view, for example, we have a city. Let's say we have a national park, and this park is a kind of natural environment. Yes, and we may approach this park from different reasons. So we may argue, for example, over its aesthetic qualities, but also we may argue over how to preserve it, and it is worth to preserve it not only for aesthetic qualities, but also for, let's say, ecological reasons, or biological reasons, or cultural reasons that are beyond aesthetic qualities. And this is quite important because this is, let's say, some objective categories imposed on a piece of land, and experiencing it, for example, as a cultural area, just experiencing it, so referring to our way of experiencing it as something valuable, something astonishing, or something just natural, something unspoiled by human, which is not possible, but let's suppose for a moment. I think it's valuable in a way, because in this is why I try to escape aesthetics, because we don't need to argue over aesthetic qualities of a given environment. We may treasure it for different reasons. For example, Jerusalem here was treasured because of different narratives, but these were religious narratives that are different from aesthetic narratives. They're completely in that regarding that place, not only Christian narrative, but we have also other narratives, strong religious narratives about this place. And aesthetic narratives here are not very important. Tourist narratives, okay, they are mainly aesthetic, but local narrative is also different than aesthetic. But I'm not sure I'm answered here, because
there's probably a preliminary point that I'm not sure if. The preliminary point is this: we speak about landscapes in a different way from the way in which we speak about experiencing environments. Okay, if I say a landscape is astonishing, or if I say a landscape is peaceful, or whatever, well, I cannot say that my way of experiencing it is experiencing the environment. I'm not saying that the way in which I experience the environment is peaceful. That is, the landscape can be very peaceful, but I am not experiencing it I'm experiencing it in a very anxious way. That is, and all the environment can be dominated by green tonalities, or can do a lot of things. That is, you just cannot replace landscape with the way in which I am experiencing the environment in most occurrence of the term landscape. So, in the first place, I urge that you probably have semantics about that stuff. That is, How is it that a statement apparently about a landscape, which does not mention in any way my way of experiencing stuff, ends up speaking about my way of experiencing stuff? That is, how precisely a sentence like this landscape is, well, very nice, turns out to speak about my way of experiencing.
So let's okay, this is the process of sharing and learning landscapes. So you're invited to tell me how you experience this environment. For example, for you, Padova is a local, you have local landscape, you have local urban landscape. For sure, I'm a tourist, so I have different landscape, I have different approach to this city than you. And this is fine. For example, for most of you, because you are live here, it is more complicated than me because I just approach from different perspective, with different approaches, without domestic stuff. This is very short trip, and so my narrative is a tourist narrative. But, for example, you can explain me that obviously that you can explain me how you experience this physical location in different way and make, I mean, it is obviously hard to for me to learn this narrative for in 1 hour or 2 hours, but we refer to the same object, which is the city, and we just do it completely differently. I'm sure that many locals share more or less similar narrative, similar approach to the city, and I'm pretty sure that many tourists, if not all of them, share quite similar narrative to mine regarding Padova. I mean, it's obviously you may have a very unique narrative, which is, for example, I have very unique narrative with my hometown, which is obviously part of my own experience. Okay.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
Let me take this. So the first question is about narratives. They play an extremely relevant role in your account because they are the normative element. Without a narrative, you, if I'm not wrong, would be left with a huge array of purely subjective experiences that could not be shared among subjects. So a lot in your account relies on this idea that if we provide a narrative, it's like as if we could provide a set of instructions by means of which one can look at a certain environment and learn to experience it as a certain landscape. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now my problem is how do we decide what constitutes a certain narrative? Can a narrative ever be wrong? I think perhaps you also say it at a certain point that there can be multiple different narratives, right, for the same environment. Sure. Yeah, of course, all your examples with the tourists and pilgrims are about that. And so how do we distinguish whether we are taking the tourists' perspective or the pilgrims' one, and can we make changes to those perspectives? Are there documents we can consult?
So, first of all, my account is neutral with any modes of appreciation. Because what you are referred, basically, first for that question, thanks for that question, but basically, you just said, you asked about whether this narrative is wrong, whether this narrative is correct, or something like that. But this is like judging the value of a given narrative. For sure, I mean, for example, that someone has completely mistaken narrative about a given place. This is not, I mean, this may be, this is possible.
But sorry,
Okay.
think about this. We could say there is a certain tourist narrative for Padua.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a specific way or a couple of ways in which it makes sense to experience Padua as a tourist.
Sure.
Okay, so one can come up with the third narrative, and we might want, some criterion to say, well, this is not a very good tourist narrative for Padua. Okay, so the point is not that the narrative is not good, but it is not good as the kind of narrative it is.
Sure.
And I have the feeling that if you want narratives to play this normative role in your account, you have to set some.
But this is
limits.
the same problem or the same thing as Alan Carlson's idea on knowledge. That you have to apply a certain kind of knowledge if you want to admire a given surrounding. So, for example, without a kind of knowledge regarding, let's say, geology, you can't aesthetically experience, I think, let's say, a Mount Massive or something like that. And you may say, because this is just a matter of the narrative you're implying, that your narrative is better from mine, let's say, for example, because your narrative explains more or make the place more interesting or more effective. Okay. But still, narratives may refer to negative values, obviously, not only positive, and we may be wrong in a way, how we experience a given environment. Because we may be deluded or we may be completely mistaken. And this is also fine with this ontological account. Because what is said is mainly, I mean, because what you're referring to is, I think, a matter of how to appreciate it in that way or another way. And if we can compare, do we need, I think we need a normative aspect of appreciation. But this is not my concern, strictly speaking. I can, because we may say that you just experience this environment in a mistaken way. Let me show you how you should experience it. So, in other words, let me give you another narrative to how experience in more, vibrant and more proper way this environment. For example, this is the case in religious places when we don't want to offend someone's religion, but we don't have any knowledge, so we ask, we know, so we ask, okay, I don't know nothing, I don't want to make any mistake, I don't want to offend my host, so just, give, obviously, in such a case, this is not my own narrative, but this is the process of the possibility of learning narratives is could be quite long.
I see. May I ask one more question?
Yeah. Because I have one answer regarding the hierarchy of
No. Go ahead then. Go ahead with your answer.
Okay, because also we may share the same narrative even if we have we perceive our narratives in a slightly different ways. For example, being a Catholic means a lot of things. That, for example, because there are some things that you have to accept, but there are some things that you may put more attention to one point and less attention to the another. And for example, my attitude, let's say, as a Catholic, and the second attitude of my father, they're a bit different because we pay attention to different things a bit, but still they count according to our theory as the same narrative. The same is with, I think, political parties, that people may basically define themselves as believers of one political position, even if they have slightly different, but This is in political narratives, in religious narrative, in artistic narratives. This is more flexible than, I think, for example, in scientific narratives. We may have very ordered and strict scientific narratives that without any element or without the proper hierarchy between them, we just have completely different narratives. I don't know, maybe. Mm-hmm.
So perhaps to go back to Becca's question, couldn't we reformulate all this talk about landscapes in terms of talk about certain aspects of environments? So we could say, well, all there is there are environments. We can do without this further entity, landscapes. And all we need to do is to understand your claims is understand that with some exercise and with some appropriate knowledge, we can come to some to have some experience of aspects of environments. Okay, so it's a matter of aspectual seeing, aspectual hearing, if you want, touching or whatever. So what is there are just environments, and there are aspects of such environments that emerge under certain conditions that are partly cultural, partly atmospherical, blah, 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 blah.
Yes, that's exactly the point, that we have one environment. I mean...
But then why do you talk about an ontology of landscapes? Sorry for the interruption, but, you postulate the existence of such entities.
Yes, but because I think firstly it is not a different, separate entity as the scenic ontology claims from the environment, and also I claim that we can't. I mean, we may, but it is we may keep the term landscape as something meaningful, and this is. Because what you just described is making sense of keeping environment as something three-dimensional, multisensual, dynamic, and so on, and at the same time to keep the term landscape as something meaningful. And this is exactly, you may call it not ontology but phenomenology, and it will be the same. I mean,
perhaps in metaphysics.
Perhaps metaphysics.
You don't need to postulate one more entity, but you can say,
we are not postulating the entity, but because the whole discussion is the whole background is the ontology, that we have scenic ontology and then we have ontology of the environment. This is why we've chosen the term ontology. Because it's. And we anticipate that question by this objection, that possible objection to our proposal, claiming that is it a mistake or not to shift from object into way of experiencing, because this is not a classical ontological shift. Obviously, this is the matter how we would like to. Maybe in term metaphysics would be better, maybe.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. So, one small detail. Maybe I'm just rephrasing a question that was already asked. But there is a point from philosophy of ordinary language, which is look at how we talk about landscape, look at the kind of predicates that we use. So it seems possible to say, for instance, look, I perceive this landscape as uniform, even though actually it isn't. So suppose that I know, for instance, I see just snow in front of me, but I know that actually if I had the right kind of training, I could perceive many different things which, as a matter of fact, I'm not able to note. Now you might say that here there is a difference between the way I experience the snow and my narrative, because my narrative is informed from some knowledge, so that actually I know that there is a lot of variety out there. But the point is that the way I talk about the environment is completely different from the way I talk about my perspective on the environment, or of my way of experiencing the environment. So there is a point, a very simple and banal point about the kind of predicates that we use when we talk about landscape, because sometimes this might seem a point in favor of the reductionist ontology. Sometimes we use the kind of predicates with reference to the landscapes that we ordinarily use about concrete and objective stuff. So you might not want to attach too much weight on this point, but nonetheless, there is a question there to look at how we talk about.
Yeah,
landscape.
I mean, sure, thanks for this question, but I think this proposal, at least it tries to be open for that, because we have, let's say, sound landscapes, or olfactory landscapes, or childhood landscapes, or legal landscapes, cultural landscapes, urban landscapes, this kind of stuff. They can't, and it is not, I mean, for example, sound landscape is not visual entity. So we have different approaches. And this term, I mean, this is why this discussion is so difficult, because it's taken from different areas, from geographical area, from legal terminology, and from art. I mean, from pictures, paintings, and so on. So, if you claim that in a usual common way, when we refer to a given surrounding, we, as a landscape, we do have some predicates in mind. It means that we have a narrative, certain narrative regarding it.
Yeah, but just a very quick rejoinder. I mean, I don't want to insist too much on this, but the point is, suppose you say, look at this landscape, look at how vast it is.
Okay.
So vast is the kind of predicate that you might apply to space, but not to a narrative. So your narrative might show.
But you just refer to landscape as an object. And this is not the ontology I'm suggesting. Your landscapes are just way of experiencing. So basically, you ascribe these qualities to the environment. So you said, what you said is, look at that landscape, it is such and such are qualities that you are ascribing to the environment. But the way that you are focusing on such elements of this environment, and for example, you treasure it as this environment as such and such, you're doing because of the narrative. I mean, maybe, I mean, it's...
So if you were to find an analogous for the attribution of the property based to a certain environment, okay? So you say, oh, look at this environment, and you call it landscape, and you say, look at how vast it is, okay? So according to your account, vast describes certain features of the environment. And to this description, there corresponds another description of an aspect of your experience that allows you to ascribe the character based to the environment, which could be something like, since I am acquainted with this and this aspect of a certain narrative about this environment, and since I have noticed, I don't know how big the horizon is, I am in the position of ascribing to the environment the property based. Would this be the kind of match
I think it is because, for example, let's we have some landscapes that live only in our memories. For example, that not as a kind of experiencing, but like a scenic views. For example, when we propose to someone, or when we drink first time a beer or wine in our life. So we do remember such a place and the mood and everything. And for example, in years when we travel to the same place, we may refer to this, oh, look at this, remember that or that, as something meaningful, obviously only because I have some personal narrative. So I can see and determine some aspects, cultural aspects of this environment because of my narrative. That's all. We may be, for example, trained as a biologist and to pay attention to some plants or herbs in a given environment. And this is everything about the objective and natural environment. But she pays a given attention, certain attention to these herbs because she has a certain, let's say, scientific narrative. And this is okay. So,
and my feeling, sorry. No, go ahead. I've talked a lot.
Well, just about narrow, one or maybe two questions about ontology in a way proper. The first question is about the ontology of narratives. That is, you can have basically two, maybe three, but let's assume two choices about the ontology of narratives. You can think that the history of narration matters. That is, think about the so-called Menard cases. Menard cases are cases, when we make believe, or we suppose, that a certain author wrote a certain story or narrative, the same story or narrative as another one, word by word identical, but the idea is that these are not the same narratives because they have been made by different people, they have a different history and stuff like that. So you can have an account, an ontology of narratives in which the history through which the narrative is born matters to the identity of the narrative, or you can have a kind of identical content ontology in which all that matters for identity of narratives is that they have the same content, say the same broad content or stuff like that. The kind of proposal changes subtly but remarkably from one ontology to the other in passing, depending on what is your ontology of narratives. And of course, this is one question, but of course, you can just answer.
I think this is the second one. It's just the content. But obviously, if you claim that narrative with a content A, B, C in one ontology, the first you describe, in the second narrative, which has the same content, but we are not taking into account the history of that narrative, that these narratives are different, let's say, I'm okay with that. Because it means that we are sharing different narratives, and for example, this is one feature is, for example, my ontological view of the history of previous narratives and so on. So for example, if you're taking into account in your narratives history, and if I'm not taking history into my narrative, it means probably that we do have different narratives, basically, if the ontological aspect is necessary. The reasons why we chosen the most neutral, even dictionary description of narrative as something that helps you to make an explanatory account of the events and chain them in some meaningful. So it's the most, because you may have different narratives. Obviously, artistic narratives differ from religious, scientific, and so on. So we just chosen. Narrative is more neutral than story, because in environmental aesthetics we have the notion of stories in order to aesthetic appreciation landscapes, and not landscape, but just nature or environment. So scientific story, artistic stories, and so on. But we decided that in, let's say, for ontological discussion, narrative is more neutral than story. Because story, it's we just decided better than narrative.
I have a few more
Yeah.
remarks,
Go
if
on.
that's okay. They're minor. So the first one is about, again, landscapes. So I was wondering whether landscapes have somehow to be the result of landscaping. I mean, does the fact that landscapes have to be experienced through a narrative also mean that landscapes can only be those parts of the environment that have somehow changed because of the action of human beings?
No. You may apply, for example, a religious narrative. Like you have a sacred forest, that it is sacred because it is not, because it is unspoiled.
Okay.
You have a narrative.
That's perfectly clear. And then a few things more about the landscape model. So that looks like a Kantian view, broadly speaking. So you said that landscape is appreciated in formal terms in a way that requires a disinterested approach and no concepts are involved. And since I really don't know this literature, I would like you to develop a little more on this.
I mean, this is like basically the landscape model covers tourist intuitions about what landscapes are. That you have to stand in a certain standpoint, and this is also, it could be also a designed experience, that this is the viewpoint, you have to stand and admire the view.
Okay.
And for example, and you just admire it like a photograph or like a painting. So you just, I think, because you are distant from it, and you are not treating yourself as a part of the environment, or at least not as a part of the admired landscape. So this is two-dimensional in a way. It's detached from us. It's just visual. It's static, and this is why I think it is, especially this landscape model is reconstructed by its critics, mainly by Carson. So,
I see.
but it's formal qualities are highlighted.
I was also a bit skeptical about the characterization of this model as a model that ignores smell and hearing. I mean, I can understand that it ignores touch, but I can certainly imagine someone standing on a certain standpoint, looking at a certain landscape, and on the one hand, feeling a certain smell coming from that landscape, and also hearing certain sounds. Okay. So you can have a static appreciation of sound. I mean, think of going to the movies.
I perfectly agree with you that it is the case in the reality. But let's say that in the literature, this model is reconstructed as just, for example, for Benowski, it is just purely visual. Even if because what he claims is that you experience through the landscape also the environment. So obviously environment is three-dimensional and you can smell it. For sure. No.
Yeah.
But ontologically speaking, landscape is different for Benowski from environment, because the first one, environment, is three-dimensional, the landscape is two-dimensional, the first one is multisensual, the second one is just purely visual.
I'm just very skeptical about this account because I don't find it persuasive.
We are also very skeptical. This is why we.
Yeah, of course, on this we agree. Also, I was, and again, this is not about your claims, but about Benowski's claim.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very puzzled by the analogy between landscapes and photographs, and you correctly pointed out some of the problems that arise from this analogy, and I just wanted to point out one more, or perhaps one aspect that I think you could stress. That is that, okay, photographs, you could say they are mind dependent in that there has to be a photographer who set up the machine that is necessary to produce a photograph. But the nice thing is that that machine produces an object that is a point of reference for everyone who wants to make an experience of an image as produced from a certain
and you can
mindset,
keep it, you can treasure it.
Mindset. Whereas with landscapes, we lack this object, right?
Yes, obviously.
So I'm just puzzled how
we thought about that point explicitly, but I just when developing the representational fallacy. So I omitted, and I just said that it is perfectly clear for photographs and environment to be separate entities, and this is perfectly clear. It is not clear in terms of landscapes.
There is a follow-up on this, that you might also make this point by noticing that it makes perfect sense to say the picture or the photo is out of focus, whereas it doesn't make really sense to say that things are out of focus. To me, it doesn't make much sense to say that a landscape is out of focus, even though the environment.
The environment is
just as it is. It's not in focus, no, out of focus. But so if you think about this kind of, again, of things you say about, it's really clear that you use different kinds of predicates in the case of photos and in the case of environment. It is not so clear.
You were just joking about the fact that you cannot, I don't know, in Italian you cannot say with the word paesaggio, which is the way we would translate landscape, but in Italian you cannot say the landscape smells ugly or anything like that. We just cannot say it. It sounds awful. It's completely out in Italian.
You cannot.
You can say that the environment smells
well, you can say that the environment smells of the environment, but you cannot say that the paesaggio smells ugly. Totally out from a linguistic viewpoint.
It could be strange also. To say that
in Italian it's terribly strange.
It could be acceptable under some circumstances, but in many cases it would be strange. This is very nice point that you mentioned about that when we have a photograph, we're producing an object. And this is the way when, for example, our personal perspective and experience, like how to frame a given environment, we make a photo, and then we have an object that everyone has access to, obviously. And we may say, okay, this is the framing, this is the result of the action you taken, and this is the point when we make the point of the reference. But again, in this scenic theory, when you have your own landscape, and I have my own, because by the definition the creator is the spectator, then I think we are losing this critical dimension of aesthetics. In case of photograph, obviously we have it, because we are arguing over a given object that we are both have access to.
Well, maybe another logical question. Do you take landscapes to be narrowly identified or broadly identified? It is identified by narrow content or by broad content. I mean, for instance, can we have the same landscape associated to very different places? For instance, I don't know, Japan and Padua, just because the kind of experience, the way in which you experience is the very same, the kind of content is the same, the kind of subjective content is the same, the kind of narratives are the same, or do you think that that cannot be right? That is, that environment is essential for landscapes?
Yeah, I mean, frankly speaking, I haven't thought about this point, so thanks for making it clear. But we mentioned that landscape is always connected with an actually experienced surrounding. So, for example, we may have some fantasies about Amsterdam, in living in Amsterdam, but without living in it, or even being for a once at least, we don't have a landscape of environment, because we don't have a way of experiencing a given surroundings. What we have, we just have some, fantasies or just beliefs or something like that.
So the live streaming is working,
okay,
because we got a question from Enrico Terrone.
Okay.
Who,
Hi, Enrico.
Yeah. Okay. Who should be hearing this? So please write your question. Sorry. He says it's about your definition of landscape in slide 41. If you wanna look at this slide, or at the definition.
We can't show it, right? We can't. I mean the presentation is.
Okay. Okay. So he said, which is the basic ontological category landscapes belong to according to your definition? Ciao. Is the landscape a universal or a particular? I think the landscape should be a universal in your definition, since you want to cast landscapes as shareable, like a types.
Okay, so we decided to make it a way of experiencing. So if the way of experience is an ontological category, which I believe it is not, in a way. It's not an object, it's not an abstract, it's like a type of experience, or a way of experiencing.
Well, if it is a type of experience.
This is why we remove the word type from the paper, and we replace it with way.
Okay.
So, for example, if religious way of experiencing belongs to an ontological category, then landscapes belongs to the same. If let's say artistic way of experiencing the environment also belongs. I mean, I just don't know to which ontological category it belongs to.
But I think one way you can hear the question is as asking whether two different persons could have the same experience of a certain environment.
They may experience it in the same way.
Okay, yeah.
Not the same experience, which is not possible.
Yeah.
Like a unit of experience, obviously, but they may experience it in the same way. Yeah. If they share the same narrative, it means that they experiencing it in the same way. So, for example, people from Christian pilgrims from Jerusalem, they may experience Jerusalem in the same way. Obviously, they have access to different experiences which can be shared, but I'm not sure I answered.
I'm just waiting for feedback. Yes, okay.
Yes, okay.
Just to make sure he doesn't have anything to add. The problem is the 200 characters limit. Ah. I didn't know there was a 200 characters limit. It's like Twitter.
It's not a kind.
Okay, so Enrico says that your first condition suggests that the landscape is a universal, but then your second condition suggests that it is a particular. And yet, if the landscape is a universal, how can it be individuated? Indeed, your individuation condition, so 2 to 5, seems to concern particulars. And then he gives you a suggestion. A landscape X is a way of experiencing an environment E by ascribing the set of features B to E in virtue of an awareness involving narrative N. So two landscapes, L1 and L2, are the same landscape if and only if E, V, and N are the same for both. Is this what you mean? I think it might be.
It might be, yes, thank you. I mean, I have to think it through.
Okay.
Can we write it down? Or can you password? Can you forward me this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You will see it online.
Okay, yeah, okay.
So it's gonna be there. And
well,
I think we can conclude this quite complicated exchange. And thanks for being here. And thanks Enrico, and for being there wherever you are. And
always.
okay, thanks Adam.
Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.